You ask a lot of questions for someone who nearly died on my porch." He shut his mouth. A long silence followed. Then, almost as if it were an afterthought, she said, "I haven't seen a man in 17 years. Micah blinked. He didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. Days passed. The storm thickened. The wind screamed through the trees like it had unfinished business. Micah stayed inside, eating sparingly, sleeping near the fire. His strength returned slowly. Ellen moved around him like he wasn't there, feeding livestock, chopping wood, cooking, reading from an old, battered book by candlelight. She spoke little, and never about herself, but Micah watched. He saw how she treated every task with care, how her hands moved with practiced certainty, how she always checked the doors twice before nightfall, and how, every morning before dawn, she stood on the porch and looked east for a long time, saying nothing. On the 5th day, he offered to help. She stared at him. "You know how to split wood." "Enough not to cut off my foot." She nodded toward the axe outside. "Then prove it." He did, chopping until sweat froze on his neck, until his shoulders burned. She watched from the window, said nothing. But that night, she placed an extra piece of dried apple in his bowl. It was the closest thing to praise he got. The next morning, he found her near the animal pen. 2 of her goats had gotten loose in the night. Their tracks disappeared into the snow-heavy woods. "I'll get him," he said. She looked at him. "They'll run if you spook them." "I'll be careful." She handed him a rope and a rusted bell. "Shake that if you need me," she said, and turned away. He found the goats an hour later near half-frozen creek. As he herded them back, he spotted something in the snow, a boot print. Fresh, not his, too wide to be Ellen's. He crouched, stomach twisting. Then he heard the click of a rifle hammer. He raised his hand slowly. A man stepped from behind a tree, face wrapped in cloth. "Well, what have we got here?" the stranger drawled. Micah didn't move. "Just passing through." "That's so? Shame. Could use a warm coat like yours." Before the man could step closer, a shot rang out. The bark above his head exploded. He ducked, eyes wide. Ellen stood on the ridge, rifle braced to her shoulder. "Next shot goes through your eye," she called. The stranger cursed and vanished into the trees. Micah exhaled slowly. They didn't speak on the walk back. That night, Ellen sat beside the fire, cleaning her rifle with slow precision. Micah sat across from her, staring into the flames. "Bandits been around before?" he asked. The wind had teeth that morning, long, ice-bitten fangs that tore across the high plains and bit into flesh without mercy. It howled down from the Bitterroot Mountains like a dying animal, scattering snow across the landscape in great tumbling sheets. There was no color, only white and gray and the bruised black of winter-struck timber. And through it, stumbling like a man on the edge of the world, came a figure hunched against the cold. Micah Dalton's boots sank into the snow with every dragging step. His coat was stiff with frost, his breath shallow and raw. The blizzard had killed his horse 2 days ago. He'd buried it under a rise with bare hands, too numb to weep, too focused on not freezing beside the animal that had carried him since Arkansas. His compass was gone, his map torn in half by the wind, and his food, what little he'd scraped from salted jerky and stale biscuits, was long since devoured. Hunger coiled low in his gut like something patient and cruel. What kept him walking was neither hope nor direction. It was something smaller, stubbornness, maybe, the need to keep moving, even if only to prove he was still alive. That was when he saw the smoke. A thin gray thread, curling against the sky like a fragile promise. He blinked, uncertain if it was real. But it held. He turned toward it, half crawling, half staggering. Snow blew sideways, stealing his sight, numbing his ears. A pine-thick ridge appeared ahead. Then the edge of a cabin, log-hewn, tightly sealed, smoke rising from a stone chimney. Windows covered in oilskin. He made it to the porch before he collapsed. The last thing he remembered was the creak of a door, the sudden darkness beyond it, and the unmistakable sound of a shotgun being cocked. Ellen Hayes didn't speak as she stepped over the man's frozen body. She stared at him for a long while. His hands were raw, lips split from cold. He smelled of death and trail dust. Her shotgun stayed level as she nudged his shoulder with her boot. He didn't stay. Idiot, she muttered. Then, with a sigh, she slung the shotgun over her back, grabbed his collar, and dragged him inside. The heat inside the cabin was thick, heavy with the scent of burning pine and boiled herbs. A pot simmered on the hearth. Shelves lined with canned vegetables and dried meats filled the far wall. The floor was swept clean. Everything had its place. She laid the man beside the fire, pulled off his boots, and began cutting away his coat. Steam rose from his clothes as they thawed. She fetched a blanket, a strip of cloth, and a bottle of pine alcohol. Her hands were steady, precise. He woke with a gasp some hours later. His eyes blinked open, confused. "Where?" "You're not dead," Ellen said flatly. "Yet." He tried to sit up but slumped back with a groan. "Drink," she said, holding out a tin cup. He took it. The broth inside was hot, rich with fat. He sipped cautiously. Then again, faster this time. She watched him in silence. "You live here?" he rasped. "For 17 years, she replied. His brow furrowed. "Alone?" She didn't answer, just sat down on the stool by the fire and began sharpening a knife. Micah stared at her, taking in the long gray braid, the leather apron, the lines carved deep around her mouth. She looked like she'd been carved from the same wood as the cabin. "I'm Micah," he said, trying for politeness. "Micah Dalton." She didn't look up. He tried again. "I came from the south, looking for my brother. He headed west last spring. Mining towns, maybe Montana." Still no answer. "You ever heard the name Dalton around these parts?" Finally, she looked up. Her eyes were pale and sharp. She nodded. "Once a year, maybe twice. They think I'm weak." "And you're not." She looked up. "You think a woman survives 17 winters here because she's lucky." Micah didn't answer. She leaned back. Her voice, when she spoke again, was softer. "My husband and I built this place before the war. Came west to escape what was coming. He died on the 3rd year. Ambushed. Left me pregnant and buried in snow." Micah's throat tightened. "What happened to the baby?" She stared at the fire for a long time. Fever took him. First winter after. Micah said nothing. What words could answer that? She stood, wrapped her shawl around her shoulders, and walked outside. The door creaked behind her. Micah stared after her, then at the fire, then at the rough wooden horse on the shelf above the hearth. It was old, worn smooth at the edges, and beside it, tucked into the shadows, was a yellowed photograph of a man with kind eyes and a quiet smile. Micah sat there a long time, listening to the wind claw at the walls, wondering if he'd ever understand the silence inside that woman's heart. The next morning, she let him into the root cellar. It was the first time she'd left the door open. They didn't speak of it, but something had shifted. In the days that followed, the storm began to ease. Micah fixed a broken hinge on the shed door. Ellen showed him how to mend a rabbit snare. They ate together without the weight of silence choking every bite. One night, after the fire burned low, Micah took out a small carving knife. He began to shape a piece of wood he'd found near the creek. "What are you making?" Ellen asked quietly. "A gift." She frowned. "Why?" He didn't answer, just kept carving. The next morning, he placed it on her table, a small wooden horse, no bigger than her hand. She didn't speak, but she didn't move it either. That evening, she placed it beside the old one on the shelf. And when Micah sat down by the fire, she brought him a blanket without being asked. Outside, the snow had stopped falling, but the clouds still hung low over the hills, and somewhere in the distance, a shadow moved where it shouldn't have. Something, or someone, was watching. Inside the cabin, Ellen stood at the window, hand resting on her rifle. Her voice came quiet, but firm. "We'll need more bullets." Micah looked up. "You expecting trouble?" She turned toward him, eyes hard as frost. "They always come back," she nodded. "Once a year, maybe twice. They think I'm weak." "And you're not." She looked up. "You think a woman survives 17 winters here because she's lucky." Micah didn't answer. She leaned back. Her voice, when she spoke again, was softer. "My husband and I built this place before the war. Came west to escape what was coming. He died on the 3rd year. Ambushed. Left me pregnant and buried in snow. Micah's throat tightened. What happened to the baby? She stared at the fire for a long time. Fever took him. First winter after. Micah said nothing. What words could answer that? She stood, wrapped her shawl around her shoulders, and walked outside. The door creaked behind her. Micah stared after her, then at the fire, then at the rough wooden horse on the shelf above the hearth. It was old, worn smooth at the edges, and beside it, tucked into the shadows, was a yellowed photograph of a man with kind eyes and a quiet smile. Micah sat there a long time, listening to the wind claw at the walls, wondering if he'd ever understand the silence inside that woman's heart. The next morning, she let him into the root cellar. It was the first time she'd left the door open. They didn't speak of it, but something had shifted. In the days that followed, the storm began to ease. Micah fixed a broken hinge on the shed door. Ellen showed him how to mend a rabbit snare. They ate together without the weight of silence choking every bite. One night, after the fire burned low, Micah took out a small carving knife. He began to shape a piece of what he'd found near the creek. "What are you making?" Ellen asked quietly. "A gift." She frowned. "Why?" He didn't answer, just kept carving. The next morning, he placed it on her table, a small wooden horse, no bigger than her hand. She didn't speak, but she didn't move it either. That evening, she placed it beside the old one on the shelf. And when Micah sat down by the fire, she brought him a blanket without being asked. Outside, the snow had stopped falling, but the clouds still hung low over the hills, and somewhere in the distance, a shadow moved where it shouldn't have. Something, or someone, was watching. Inside the cabin, Ellen stood at the window, hand resting on her rifle. Her voice came quiet, but firm. "We'll need more bullets." Micah looked up. "You expecting trouble?" She turned toward him, eyes hard as frost. "They always come back." The morning broke cold but clear, and for the first time in nearly a week, the sunlight cast long, golden streaks across the snow. Ellen stood with her back to the fire, sharpening a blade on the whetstone with rhythmic precision. Outside, Micah loaded kindling into a burlap sack. He didn't say much. He rarely did in the early hours. But something in his movement had changed. Less hesitation, less waiting for permission. He came in without knocking. She looked up. He held out a rabbit, freshly snared. She took it wordlessly and began the process of gutting it with practiced ease. They worked without speaking. That was a new rhythm now. Silent cooperation, steady hands, glances that lingered just a second longer than they used to. They hadn't spoken of the bandit in the woods. Not directly. But every night since, Ellen kept her rifle closer. And Micah never slept without his knife under his bedroll. Later that afternoon, Ellen handed him a woven pouch. "Try the creek," she said. "Set 3 traps. Not 4. 4th one always snaps shut too early." He nodded, took the bag, and left. She watched from the window as he disappeared into the trees. The wind had changed. Micah found the creek frozen along the banks, but still flowing slow and black in the center. He crouched beside it, tested the edge with his boot, and knelt to set the snares. As he worked, he noticed a faint trail again, hoof prints, just beyond the ridge. Old, but not ancient. Not his, not Ellen's. He didn't call for her this time. He took note, memorized the direction, and returned just before dusk. When he stepped back into the cabin, he held out a small brooch, tarnished silver, turquoise set into the center. "Found it near the creek," he said. "Could be from one of those riders." Ellen stared at it for a long while. She didn't reach for it, didn't speak. Micah set it gently on the table and walked away. She picked it up that night after he fell asleep and stared at it under the lantern's flicker. Her fingers curled tight around it, and for a moment her face twisted, not in fear, but memory. The next morning, they were different. Ellen handed him a worn map. "If you're looking for mining towns, there's 2 left out east. One burned down last year. The other's half buried in snow." Micah raised an eyebrow. "You've been there?" "Long ago," she replied, "before it all changed." They sat at the table over weak coffee and smoked trout, the quiet between them less brittle than before. Later, she taught him to clean the rabbit he'd caught. "Don't tear it," she said. Ruin the pelt that way. I wasn't planning on sewing a coat. Maybe not now. She paused. But you might want to remember how. Her eyes met his. For a moment, something unspoken hovered between them. That night, Ellen dreamed. It came suddenly, like a curtain pulled back on an old theater. She stood in the same cabin, but younger, hair loose, belly round with child. Her husband, Thomas, laughed beside her, carving a wooden horse. The fire glowed warm. Then it changed. Gunshots, fire, screams. The door splintered inward. She ran, stumbling into snow, barefoot, blood on her hands. The baby cried once. Then silence. She woke with a jerk, breath heaving, chest tight. Micah was outside, pacing near the livestock shed, eyes sweeping the trees. She opened the door quietly, stepping into the cold without shoes. Something wrong? She asked. He looked over, surprised. Thought I heard something. Could have been nothing. She walked beside him, arms crossed against the chill. You don't strike me as the type to worry over nothing. I'm not. They stood in silence. Finally, she said, You're not the first man to come out of the woods this way. Michael waited. Most never made it past the first night. He didn't respond, just nodded. She turned away. Come inside. I'll warm something. Later, she placed a cup of broth by his bed without comment. He didn't thank her, but when she turned away, she felt his eyes stay on her longer than before. By midweek, they began moving through tasks together. She showed him how to dry herbs. He taught her a saddle stitch that wouldn't unravel in rain. She opened up about the terrain, the frozen ridge where wolves hunted, the black creek that swallowed horses whole. In tone, he began speaking of his brother. Caleb was the smart one, always chasing after big dreams. He headed west when the letters stopped coming from home. Said he'd strike silver, build something that lasts. That was 2 winters ago. Have you heard anything since? Micah shook his head. Just stories. A man with Dalton eyes working near Helena. Might have been him. Might not. She watched him quietly, reading what he didn't say. And what if he's dead? Micah's jaw flexed. Then I'll bury him proper. And come back south. To what? He didn't answer. Later, he left her a wooden carving on the table. A wolf this time. Lean, silent, poised. She didn't comment, but she left her shawl draped across his chair that night when he came in from the cold. They were still strangers in many ways, but something had started to crack between them. Not like glass, like ice underfoot, slow, deliberate. That evening, the wind shifted again, and with it came a sound neither had heard in weeks. Hoofbeats. Ellen stepped out first, rifle in hand. Micah followed, silent. In the distance, just beyond the ridgeline, stood a man. Tall, silent, wrapped in a faded blue blanket, thick with dust and time. His face bore old scars, one slicing across the chin, another near the eye. He raised a hand, not in threat, but greeting. Micah reached for his knife. Ellen didn't move. Toka, she said. The name was barely a whisper. Micah looked at her, confused. She stepped forward, lowering the rifle. The man spoke in Lakota, a low rumble, deliberate, almost reverent. He says you shouldn't have stayed this long, she translated, and that men are coming. Micah frowned. What men? 6 of them, riding hard. Said they passed through the low valley 2 days ago. Took a child and a woman. Burned a barn. Toka saw them. She nodded. He's been tracking them. Micah looked at the stranger. And who is he to you? Ellen hesitated. My husband's friend, the one who carried his body back. Toka nodded, solemn, then spoke again. He says they seek land, not blood, but they'll take both if no one stops them. Micah clenched his jaw. They are coming here. Toka didn't answer, but his silence said enough. That night, the 3 sat around the fire, silent but alert. Toka cleaned his blade with ritual precision. Micah reloaded Ellen's Henry rifle. Ellen stitched leather patches onto her coat, fast, methodical. They said little, but their preparation said everything. The next morning, Ellen stepped into the clearing and pointed to the western slope. If they come, it'll be from there. The wind always masks hoofprints along that path. Micah nodded. I'll set traps near the ridge. Toka said something in Lakota. Ellen translated. They won't wait for nightfall. They think no one remembers how to fight out here. Then we remind them. Micah said. The fire crackled between them. Ellen reached into her chest and pulled out an old envelope. Micah watched as she unfolded the brittle paper, yellowed with age. My husband wrote this the day before he died. She read aloud, voice steady. If love survives the winter, let it be enough. If no one finds you, if no one remembers the road we built, remember this, you are still made of fire. She folded it gently, pressed it to her lips, then tucked it into her coat. Micah looked at her, something tightening in his throat. He stepped forward, took her hand. She didn't pull away. They stood there, close but unspeaking. Then she did something she hadn't done in 17 years. She smiled, only faintly, only for a moment, but it was real. Outside, the wind began to rise again, and with it, the faint, unmistakable thunder of hooves. Snowflakes drifted lazily from the sky, light at first, then heavier, as if the clouds themselves knew what was coming and had begun mourning early. The world around the cabin lay in hushed suspense, still, frozen, waiting. In the distance, beyond the tree line where shadows stretched long and pale across the earth, the sound of hooves rolled in like distant thunder. 6 riders. No more, no less. The same number Ellen remembered from that night 17 years ago. Time hadn't softened her memory. It had sharpened it, carved it into the bone. Toka crouched behind a fallen log, eyes fixed on the horizon. His breathing was slow, deliberate. He'd scattered obsidian shards and iron caltrops along the ridge path, traps designed not to kill but to delay and wound, just enough to stagger the incoming tide. Micah stood by the cabin side wall, hat low over his brow, rifle clutched in both hands. He'd double-checked the sight that morning, cleaned the barrel, counted every bullet. He had 13, no more. He'd need to make every shot count. Inside, Ellen moved with unshakable calm. She laid out bandages beside the fire, poured water into the kettle, checked the small revolver she had in use in over a decade. Her heart pounded steadily, but not from fear, from focus, the kind that only years of solitude could teach, a sharpened edge born of silence, loss, and repetition. She wasn't just defending her home. She was defending the ghost of her son, the memory of her husband, and the tiny flicker of hope she'd let grow in Micah's presence. The first shot came just before dusk, a crack like lightning splitting bark. One of the riders had triggered a trap. He screamed, tumbled from his saddle, ankle torn by the caltrops. The others wheeled around, rifles raised, scanning the trees. Toka moved like wind, his form barely visible as he slipped behind another rock, another tree. He didn't fire. Not yet. Micah raised his rifle and took the first shot. The bullet struck a rider in the chest, sending him sprawling backward. The horse reared, bolted. Chaos bloomed in an instant. Gunfire erupted. The air exploded with smoke and the sharp whine of ricochets. Ellen stood at the window, rifle braced against her shoulder. Her first shot cracked a man's collarbone. He dropped his weapon, rolled behind a stump. She ducked low, reloaded, fired again. Quick, clean, efficient. They were not invincible, these men, but they were mean and desperate, and those two things made them dangerous. One of them reached the shed. Micah sprinted from cover to intercept. He tackled the man behind the structure, both of them crashing into the snow. Fists flew, elbows connected. Micah took a knife across the ribs. He howled, drove his boot into the man's gut, and slammed the rifle stock against his jaw. The man dropped. Blood soaked Micah's shirt, hot against the freezing air. He stumbled back toward the cabin. Ellen met him at the door. Inside. Now. She helped him inside, set him near the fire, and pressed a cloth to the wound. It's shallow, she muttered. Hurts like hell. But you'll live. He gritted his teeth, sweat beading on his brow. How many left? 3, she replied. A crack outside. Toka didn't scream. But Ellen knew. She stepped outside with her rifle, heart clenched in her chest. behind the livestock pen. Toka lay on the ground, blood spreading beneath him like spilled ink. He looked up at her, face stoic, eyes clear. He touched the pouch at his chest. Inside it, a braid of her son's hair he had carried for 17 winters. Then he let out a long breath. Still, silent, Ellen knelt, pressed a hand to his chest, and whispered something only the wind could hear. The last 3 riders regrouped near the ridge. One barked orders. Another took out a torch, lit it, and held it high. "They're going to burn us out," Micah said from inside, voice hoarse. Ellen stood just inside the doorway, rifle in hand. "Let them try." The men advanced slowly, cautiously, knowing the land might still bite them. Then, like a sudden storm, Ellen burst from the cabin. She moved like someone with nothing left to lose, hair wild in the wind, coat flying behind her like a banner. She fired once, struck the torch from the leader's hand. Fire burst against the snow and hissed out. He turned, shouting, raising his revolver. She shot again, straight through his chest. He crumpled like a felled tree. The second rider ran, but a trap caught his leg mid-step. He screamed, dropped his weapon. The last man, face hidden beneath a blood-stained kerchief, stood frozen. "You remember me," Ellen said, voice carrying over the snow. 17 years. You came here once before. You burned my home, killed my husband, left me in the dark." He said nothing, but his hands trembled. "I buried him behind the barn," she continued, "and I swore if any of you ever returned, I'd send you back to hell." She fired. The shot rang through the valley. And then silence. No riders remained. No more gunshots. Just wind and snow and breath. She stood still for a long time. Micah stumbled out of the cabin, clutching his side. "They're gone," he rasped. Ellen lowered her rifle. The fire inside had began to cool. Later, they buried Toka beside Thomas, Ellen's husband. She carved his name into a piece of pine and drove it into the ground. Beneath it, she placed the old braid he carried so long. Micah stood beside her, one hand resting gently on her shoulder. That night, the cabin was quiet, not with fear or dread, but with reverence. Micah sat by the fire, a blanket over his knees, carving something small from a piece of driftwood. When he finished, he held it up, a second wooden horse. Ellen took it in her hand, studied it, and without a word, placed it beside the first one on the shelf. She stood there a long time, then turned to him. Without asking, without words, she crossed the floor, wrapped her arms around him, and held him. He didn't flinch. He didn't speak. He held her too. In that quiet, wrapped in each other's presence, no ghost spoke. No shadow stirred. Only breath. Only warmth. The next morning, the snow began to melt. Only a little. But it was enough. Ellen stood on the porch, the sunrise soft across her face. Micah stepped beside her. She handed him a spade. "What for?" he asked. "We've got a garden to dig." He chuckled, soft, surprised. "You think it'll grow?" "Depends." "On what?" She looked at him, eyes gentle. "On whether you stay." Micah didn't answer. He just took the spade. That afternoon, they pulled broken boards from the fence line, planted seeds in cold, trembling soil. The earth didn't give easily, but it gave just enough. Ellen found herself humming as she worked, a lullaby her husband used to sing. The words had faded, but the melody lingered. Micah didn't speak. He just listened. That night, they sat side by side, watching the fire dance. He played the tune again, softly, from a harmonica she didn't know he had. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in nearly 2 decades, didn't dream of fire and screams. She dreamed of rain on the roof, of a child laughing, of something green pushing through the frost. The riders would not return, but life might, if they let it. As the screen fades to black, the narrator's voice returns, low and resonant. If this story touched something in you, the idea that even in the loneliest corners of the world, love might still find a way, then share it. A pause. Leave a comment. Let us know what part stayed with you. And if you haven't yet, subscribe for more stories of fire, frost, and the hope that lives between. The wind outside begins to rise again. But inside the cabin, the fire still burns.